If you were to imagine journalism at its best in the next decade, what role do you hope it plays in shaping our collective response to planetary crises?
I'll still stick with the notion that journalism is not singular. Journalism is a general concept, but journalists come in all varieties. If you have intentionality, if you want to become in your community a source of reliable information in turbulent times, you can do that. But you're seeing it now with Minnesota. People with phones are now reality checking and exposing malfeasance. A key part of that pathway is to actually recognize and embrace the complexity of these problems.
I'm Zoe Weil, and this is Solutionary Voices, where we bring together guests on the forefront of creating a more humane, just, and healthy world for all people, animals, and the ecosystems that sustain life. Today, I'm talking to Andrew Revkin, former New York Times climate and environmental reporter who currently hosts Sustain What, a video webcast and Substack that seeks solutions to thorny environmental and societal challenges. We need solutionaries in every arena, and I am delighted to have a solutionary journalist with us today. Welcome, Andy.
Hey, it's great to be with you. I'm a big fan.
Thank you. Likewise. So the first question we always ask, what problem are you working to solve?
Solve is a funny word. My goal is to get people focused on directionality. How do you go in the direction of betterment? And how do you define betterment? The sustain what concept is about questions that lead toward better trajectories for us and the environment around us, for us and our neighbors, both human and otherwise. And I think the word solve kind of gets in the way sometimes. So I'm not, which is why I like solutionary. It's an attitude more than an outcome. And for me, the big challenge is building a more productive relationship and a humane relationship between us and our neighbors and our environment. And as I said, neighbors is a pretty wide term.
How has covering climate and the environment over so many decades affected your current sense of how these stories should be told?
You know, I started out in the 1980s, with a pretty simplistic idea that most journalists, at least of my generation, grew up with, which is if you tell a good story and policy will change and people will change and all will be well. And climate felt like a pretty binary story. You know, it's simple, really. We're polluting the atmosphere with, in this case, an invisible gas that's part of nature, carbon dioxide. But if you add too much of it, it creates climate change, and that creates lots of challenges. So it felt sort of straightforward because I'd grown up, again, like most people in the 20th century, with the idea of pollution problems being just turn off the spigot or put a filter on it and the problem goes away. But climate was so much bigger than that. Luckily, my first article about it, back in the first big article in 1988, when I look back at my reporting, I was pretty pleased that I did capture some of the complexity even then. I wrote about China. I said, who are rich countries now? What gives us the right to tell a poor developing country, which China was at that time, not to use the fuels that we use to get rich? So that was in that story back then. But still, overall, it felt like, okay, it's a pollution problem, pass a law. And the longer I stayed with that story, and I did, through all these years, the more I realized that there was a complexity. So I was stuck in this mode of thinking of a story like climate change as being pretty much the problem and the solution being pollution. And then I realized, well, development is a big part of it. The energy needs, which always for humans still are a primary need. Whether you're in a cold place or a hot place, whether you have to have energy to do things that help you survive. And climate change is sort of a secondary problem. So those dimensions really led me toward a new way of covering it. When I was at the New York Times, I started a blog in 2007, along with my regular articles, old-fashioned newspaper articles. And the blog gave me a different way of looking at the issue and conveying it in more of a conversation with my
So climate change is occurring because of a convergence of many systems: energy, food, transportation, economic, political, production, along with culture and human psychology. How do you think journalism can shift to cover these many interconnected systems rather than focusing solely or primarily on isolated issues and stories?
Blogging is not the solution to anything on its own. But what blogging particularly did for me starting in 2007 and going forward at the New York Times and now with Sustain What, I think of it as pretty much a blog. What that allows you to do is to capture the various dimensions on different days, to go deeper on things, as opposed to what I used to do, which was just kind of convey a story, maybe with better graphics. I guess it's because if you're dealing with an issue that has the dimensions you just described, it's disingenuous to try to capture the solution part in just an article that has a solitary dimension. And if you try to cram too much stuff into a particular story, then no one knows where to begin and end. So it's a conversation. If you move toward having a real dialogue with your, not just with your readers, but with experts, where you're connecting readers and sources of expertise, and you're enabling your audience to be on its own learning journey, where you're not saying, come to me like you're a professor in a classroom or you're a preacher, follow me. There's no way you can get one person, whether it's me or anyone else, who can lead you through all those different dimensions of a problem. And I guess so being less selfish as a journalist is important, meaning sometimes saying, actually, you should read that guy's work or that woman's work. Or you should look at this blog out of India about farming practices. I'm not going to go to India anymore. I have gone there for articles, but if I'm able to connect people with sources of insights there and elsewhere, and or on the different dimensions, biofuels, what's realistic with them, what's the problem with them. I know who you should go to for that, but I'm not going to be the person who you should always listen to. So I guess it's letting go of the idea of yourself being the answer person and building a community, truly building a community around these issues, I think is important.
So you just brought up farming in India, and I'm wondering why you think there's relatively little climate-focused journalism about animal agriculture and meat production, given their massive contribution to both global warming and biodiversity loss, as well as environmental degradation.
Some of it's history. Again, the climate problem emerged initially primarily around smokestacks and tailpipes. It's right up there with the other things coming out of burning fossil fuels. And some of the farming problem is also fossil fuels. And the problem, I think, for many journalists, getting out of that mindset about it being an industrial source as the dominant issue is you immediately get into the complexity, right? It's there are farming practices that are organic, but they're not necessarily good for the climate. You could make the argument, if you want to be climate centric, which I think is a bad idea when you're thinking about agriculture, that Walmart's strawberries are actually lower carbon than your getting strawberries at your farmer's market, because those involve a lot of people driving in different places to bring their strawberries to market. And I wrote about this a long time ago at the New York Times. Large-scale agriculture creating a lot of strawberries in California, getting them on one truck and bringing them to, let's say, Fishkill, New York, to a Walmart where I used to live. For carbon is good, but not for all the other questions around agriculture. So you're immediately in a tangled environment. It's not one story. And I think pollution from a smokestack or a tailpipe is sort of like one story. And a lot of the activists in the climate arena, similarly, their main villain has historically been Exxon and when you get into the farming arena, it gets complicated in a hurry. And journalists don't like complexity.
That's so interesting because it doesn't feel particularly complicated to me that meat is a climate disaster. It just doesn't get in the news. It's not reported on very often. And even when it is reported on, it dies on the vine pretty quickly, to mix some metaphors there.
You and I both recently read Bruce Friedrich's book about the future of meat. And so meat as we know it, for sure, has been a primary driver of not only you have the direct emissions from livestock, but you have deforestation in the Amazon. My first book in 1990 was about the burning of the Amazon rainforest. And back then, as now, livestock meat production, beef particularly, is one of the primary drivers of deforestation. Why it isn't a primary focus in the journalism world, I think I'll get back to that idea that journalism likes to distill things down, particularly environmental journalism as we know it, is still stuck in a kind of good guy, bad guy framing around issues like climate change, and industry is the bad guy, and it's mostly directly about fossil fuels. And so there's a tendency to whittle off the parts of the landscape that are more complicated. And even for deforestation, it gets complicated. I was in the Amazon 3 years ago in Belém, and I hadn't been back since 1990, so I was learning a lot. And there was a environmental science group there who's working carefully on understanding ways to stop added deforestation in Brazil. And one of the ways is by intensifying your beef production, which won't sound promising to someone who's focused on animal welfare, because essentially stockyards and getting more beef from less land means having more of the stuff that Chicago was infamous for. But it's slowing deforestation.
Let me interrupt for just 1 second.
Yeah.
Given that those cattle, even if they're in a feedlot and they're confined, have to be fed, and they're going to be fed, soy and other products that are going to be grown in massive quantities to fatten them. So how is it a net gain for the environment?
It's just taking down less primary forest.
But aren't they using the primary forest for feed production as well?
No, most of that comes from other parts of Brazil that have their own environmental issues, but it's not taking down rainforest. So again, and there's been plenty of studies. There was a paper way back in the 90s about agricultural intensification, getting more production from less land as being a way to spare, what they call forest sparing. You're saving more land for forests or other kinds of ecosystems that might be otherwise imperiled by further deforestation.
So they're not arguing that meat production is better environmentally than producing plants. They're just arguing that feedlot production is better than grazing cattle on former rainforest land. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. It's all about acreage and getting more tonnage of meat from less land.
Right, but we could get vastly more food if we just...
But, this gets to Bruce Friedrich's point about, the path to a post-meat world is different than the path to a world of meat that's produced in ways that don't come with more harm.
I'm going to move us to another question. So what's generally considered reputable journalism are stories that share, quote unquote, both sides of a story, as if there are only two sides, when of course there are many sides, and as if the two sides are of equal validity. So how do you think we can change this persistent flaw in reporting stories?
It's one of the more profound issues in journalism. And I think the way I've framed it in the past is what we want to be as journalists is to be fair and accurate which is different than being fair and balanced, which was Fox News' old mission statement. Fair and balanced is implicitly both oversimplifying and in other ways really deceptively shifting what an audience is experiencing compared to what's true. And that the hard thing is journalism is, you got a reporter on deadline. You have an audience with limited attention span, particularly for the electronic media. And so the simplest way is to say something happened and so says it's a catastrophe and so says it's not. And that pattern is just really tough to break. I think when I articulate what fair and accurate means, that implies you have to do a little more work and you have to write more and not just rely on people in kind of a stenographic way. This is an issue in journalism, along with the fair and balanced, is we'll tend to go to, let's say, elected lawmakers to talk about lobster fishing, issues, as opposed to actually, and then you're getting people's politically framed points of view instead of actually talking to scientists who can lay out the data on whether northern right whales are being, entangled by Maine lobster gear or not. You end up in fights over federal regulation right away, and so you're distorting when you go also to sort of the loudest voices or the most familiar voices. You're also adding a level of distortion that can be problematic. Getting the science in front of people, the data, the bedrock data, whether it's on climate or animal welfare or ocean conditions, takes more work. I grew up in an era in the latter part of the 20th century when journalism was thriving. And, some of the more profitable companies on the planet were news operations because they had a lot of advertising. And that's all gone away. And you see the data on the journalism. It's horrific in terms of job loss. AI is not even factoring in yet, but that's going to add to it too. So you have that absolute reduction in capacity. And then for people who are specialists who could do the science stuff, they're an endangered species as well. And the audience has become very fickle. We just flick from one screen to the next, and as an audience, and that's really problematic too. So it's a really tough time. If your goal is to have a reality-based discussion of these tough multidimensional issues, this is not the best of times. But we have to figure out ways, both as audiences and as writers or videographers or data journalists, you have to really work with what you've got right now. And it's doable, but it's not easy.
I'm wondering how algorithms and attentional disruption and clickbait titles have reshaped what journalism rewards.
Yeah, the metrics are things like time on site, how much time eyeballs stay on your website. And obviously you want to get attention in that moment when your content is flashing across someone's screen. And that can lead to sort of an oversimplification that, unfortunately, to my eye, and I've written about this since really before the real social media explosion, 2008, when I was still at the New York Times, I wrote an article about what I was seeing. It's kind of a whiplash effect you get as an audience on, let's say, coffee and health. You'll see some study that we amp up as news reporters. Oh, the new study says coffee is good for your sex life. And then 2 months later, it's linked to some rare form of cancer. And 2 months later, something else about coffee. And so what you're doing is actually creating a kind of a whiplash effect that prompts your audience to disengage instead of engaging. I see this continually on climate. where even like now with the recent nor'easter in the north here and along the Northeast, some journalists are making the climate change point, saying, well, yeah, a warmer world can lead to worse winter storms, but they're doing it in ways that are oversimplified and can lead quickly on social media, particularly, to sort of a backlash. And they're the people who are saying it's not that easy are correct. So if you're trying to use this latest storm to make a point about global warming, there's a good chance you're actually going to disengage your audience because there'll be all this debate about it, as opposed to the basics of global warming, which are so profound and foundational that only a few people like our president can find ways to scoff at them. So whiplash, if you're trying too hard to get attention with your issue, whether it's meat or climate, or if you're trying so hard that you're tempted to overstate something, then you're basically creating this whiplash potential in the audience, I think, and ultimately would just disengage.
So you've written about the danger of single narratives, and I'd love it if you could describe what you mean by that. I mean, you've talked about it, you've referred to that a little bit already, but and then talk about what narratives about climate and the environment do you think are most harmful and or helpful right now?
In the long run, think about whale conservation. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was all about rarity. Save the whales. And I wrote a piece in the New York Times 2006 or 2007 when I noticed the research was starting to find some whale species are rebounding wonderfully, minke whales. And, this is when Japan still had its really big fleets out there hunting for whales for whale meat, almost as a patriotic thing. And what I was writing was, if you built your whole argument around rarity and the species is now abundant, where do you go from there? And it turned out that a number of environmental groups weren't actually talking to animal welfare groups. Animal welfare groups were saying you shouldn't be blasting harpoons with hand grenades in their grenades in their tips into a living being, and it was then that created a need for a pivot from the environmental community. If you're stuck on your rarity narrative, then you better think about that, because maybe there are other issues that are equally important. And I think lately that issue, that particular one, has tipped much more toward humane treatment of marine mammals than rarity. Although, I've written about rarity, the rare species too. So that's one narrative thing. Don't get too stuck on thinking your approach is the one that will have longevity. Then there's narrative capture. I actually made a hashtag out of this on social media at one point, which is where, we're all captured by narratives. There's a whole multi-billion-dollar industry of advertising, which spends huge amounts of money to capture our attention with a narrative, whether it's to sell a car or whatever. The more problematic one to me is when we create our own internal narrative. And journalists do this, newsrooms do this. I saw this, on many issues I covered, not just environmental, where the newsroom kind of has a perception, this is the story, and then you lose track and the data kind of start to build, and turns out it's different. And it takes a long time to sort of liberate yourself from your internal narrative about something. And that's problematic. And I see that over and over again, whether it's with climate. To me, the media and activists around the climate issue have, I think, irresponsibly, even dangerously neglected the resilience side of the climate problem, which is, it's not just about cutting greenhouse gas emissions. You have to really focus on cutting risk in communities and or ecosystems. And those are very different parts of the problem. They're fundamentally different. We could turn off all of the power plants in the world today, and that's not going to stop tornadoes from forming in the Midwest. It's not going to stop coastal storms from ravaging coastlines. And many decades would have to pass before the pace of sea level rise would slow, for example. So you just say, oh, we won. We turned off all the power plants. No, it doesn't work that way. And then you have communities all around the world who are building more vulnerability. We're building into areas of risk. So if your narrative is just about, suing Exxon and deriding climate deniers, then you're denying the vulnerability side of the problem. So narratives, the ones that we make ourselves, I think are almost more problematic in that they can cut us off from thinking about other ways to address an issue, to be solutionary.
I so appreciate everything you've said. And one of the things that it reminds me of that I have written about for many, many years is when the debate was between the saving the northern spotted owl and jobs for loggers. In the Pacific Northwest, that was such a huge issue. And the Endangered Species Act required that we protect the old growth habitat for the northern spotted owl. And, it became so vicious, and there were sort of these two sides, and we weren't looking at how can we protect jobs, or, if not these same jobs, how can we retrain for other jobs? How can we protect the owls? And then it went out of the news. And now it's back in the news again because barred owls have moved into northern spotted owl habitat, and they're out competing northern spotted owls. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is now going to be is advocating for killing these barred owls. And it gets to that same sort of question that you brought up, or the issue you brought up about the whales. And for people who were on the side of the northern spotted owl, the environmentalists back in the day in the 1990s, where are they now? That it's okay to just kill barred owls because they're out competing their cousins? These things need to be thought of in a very nuanced way. These are complex issues, and I love that you bring that to journalism. So that gets me into another question about, how we perceive a reputable journalism, and I'm using scare quotes around reputable, is it's not supposed to promote pathways for collaborative solutionary change that looks at root and systemic causes and strives to find solutions that do the most good and the least harm for everyone, for people, animals, and the environment. And I'm wondering if you think that is another flaw in the system of journalism itself.
There are these little nodes of hope within the journalism community. There's a substantial network called Solutions Journalism Network, which is all about, it's not about advocating for a particular solution. It's about covering issues in ways that reveal all these different pathways, just as you do with your work. And for example, I'm not even referring to some particular story, but being in Maine with you, I think about the lobstering community and the whales. And there's been these simplistic efforts to say, oh, they just need to stop using gear with ropes and we'll all be done. And that comes about only if you're not talking to lobster communities as part of your effort to conserve whales and or sustain local livelihoods. Because you have to understand what their current culture is, how the sort of rope-based gear works, and then you can start to talk about how you facilitate experimenting with gear that doesn't have ropes. But if you're not having those conversations, or if you're just saying we need to save the whales and have a federal regulation that says no more lobstering or that kind of thing, it's so simplistic, and it just kind of furthers the sort of political polarization around tough issues. And that's just one example, but solutions journalism is really about covering the system and letting these pathways be revealed through the journalism. I think it's really important. But the other reality is that takes work. There are entities that do it. The Maine Monitor here, an online website, they do a good job of sort of looking at systemic challenges. but they're really still kind of the minority. It is these like nodes of hope, as I said earlier. Most journalism still relies on templates for stories. And as I said earlier, good guy, bad guy is one of the simplest templates. And, on the right wing side, of course, it's about offshore wind development in Wales, and the data aren't there, but they still do the same kind of simplistic approach. So there's a lot of work to be done, which I think is, means there's an opportunity to spread that gospel.
Through a solutionary lens, we wouldn't only be talking about whales and lobster men and lobster women. We'd also be talking about the lobsters. Who's representing their voice? Is it even coming up in a story that there's plenty of evidence that a lobster being thrown into boiling water is a pretty gruesome death for that lobster. But that's never in the story, right? Like, you may get the story about the fishing lines and the complexity of this, but nobody's writing about the lobsters, except maybe PETA, right? People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or some animal rights group. So how do we also talk about these animals? I mean, I remember back in the day when people were learning about the capture of dolphins in the tuna industry. And so then there were all these labels, dolphin safe tuna. But what about the tuna? People were not thinking about these huge sentient animals. They're not mammals, but they're still capable of suffering. And when they're caught by their sensitive mouths on a hook and then dragged by their mouths and then suffocated to death or bludgeoned to death. I mean, that's pretty gruesome death, but it was never talked about. So that's just another layer that we would add on.
I've experienced that debate directly with two good friends who have very different journeys in marine conservation. One is Carl Safina, who's a wonderful writer who's focused in the last decade very much on animal feelings and in his writing. But he's also a fishing fan, as I am, although I haven't fished in a long time. He's an angler. And I've gone out with him in his boat, and we've actually caught striped bass, many of which are released, but as you say, tortured before they're released. And the other person who's a good friend is Sylvia Earle, who's all about not catching fish as part of ocean conservation. And I keep wanting to get them out on one boat together to talk this through, because I think this is really tough. Growing up in Rhode Island as a kid, I think fishing was one of my main portals to loving the ocean and caring, and streams and rivers and caring for the world. And I did off and on get an understanding of that this was not good for the fish I was catching. So you have that question, how, you want to spur, well, as Ayanna Johnson would say, you want to use the ocean without using it up. The debate about the moral, the ethical, the humane aspects of that is sometimes a tough one that's hard to get to a root solution that would be satisfying for all the parties. I think it's kind of like what we were saying about, well, meat is different. Again, if you can end up making meat from cells so that we greatly reduce the suffering that comes through slaughter and livestock rearing, that's a really profound change. If you like fishing, that's different. It's kind of like all our neighbors here in Maine who like hunting, not just, who hunt for their food. And also, but who enjoy being out there and enjoy that challenge. That's tough. I'm not sure there is a single endpoint to that story.
Well, I'll tell a story about a friend of mine he's an avid fisherman. He's been an avid fisherman for many, many, many decades. And we never really talked about it. It was one of those things that we both knew how the other person felt, and we just didn't talk about it. And we had the opportunity to reconnect, and we were hiking, and I brought it up, and he said, I've been meaning to talk to you about this. And so he was glad to have the conversation. And what had happened for him is over time, he had become so attuned to the fish that he stopped using a hook at all. And his goal was to see if he could get the fish to come toward his line. He was a fly fisherman, come toward it and grab it, but would not bite a hook. And that was as satisfying to him. And he's pretty much stopped catching the fish. I thought that was really interesting. And he no longer wanted to hurt them. So I think that, we humans can evolve in how much we place our own pleasure over the suffering of others. And so I like to think that there's an answer to that, and it's that we can evolve to be that much more compassionate and loving and find other ways to meet that same need.
Also, I've been in places where if you're in a place for a long enough period of time, you'll get to know a particular fish who lives under a dock, or who is there's you see this often in, not so much here where it's too cold for me to spend a lot of time underwater, but when I've been in warm water areas, I lived for a time with a family in French Polynesia when I was a young'un, and you could literally get to know a particular fish or other organism, and I think that's part of that pathway you're talking about. And certainly there are sports like orienteering and that can give you a sense of being out in nature and not necessarily going the next step. Potentially, it's a long path for many people.
But that's what, as a humane educator, I feel like part of my role is to invite people to go on that journey. So what kinds of stories do you think that we need right now to help people feel like they are capable of contributing to positive solutions rather than feeling just overwhelmed with a sense of doom? And this is, going back to climate and the environment.
A key part of that pathway is to actually recognize and embrace the complexity of these problems. To know that there's no moment when we will solve the climate problem. We don't solve the climate crisis because of these many dimensions. It's kind of like public health or poverty, or there's certain issues that are sufficiently multidimensional that you find the spot in this problem, the facet of it that fits your predispositions and your skills and your geography, and you dive in on that element. And the other thing you do is when you're doing your work, and I don't mean work meaning necessarily your profession, but when you're doing, whether it's weatherizing your house or growing your own food, you share that. The miracle of online connectivity is such that we now can really maximize the value of individual action by sharing our actions with others, whether it's a Facebook group or just emailing friends and say, hey, I just tried this thing. And in developing countries, I think they're kind of ahead of us to a certain extent. Well, I shouldn't say they're ahead of us. You see great examples of this here in North America. In India and parts of Africa, there's this entity I wrote about, it must be 15 years ago when it was starting, called digitalgreen.org. And it's basically gives you a way for a farmer in a tiny village in India to create a little video explaining a farming practice that she adopted that's a little better. This is the same thing that farmers used to do at the Grange Hall or at the seed store. And now we have that capacity to take that individual small action in one dimension of a big problem and propagate it. Those traits and capacities lead to better outcomes.
So I love that. And I'm also wondering, is there room for the headline? Is there room for major news sources to be promoting solutionary ideas and approaches?
Yeah, by covering it the old-fashioned way. There's lots of examples. Recently visited Camden, Maine, where there's a very interesting journalism project. It's some of the local newspapers in that part of Maine consolidated, and there's now the Mid-Coast Villager, and they have a cafe where the journalists hang out in their building where they're working, but they can hang out with their readers. People come in with a question, our road's really messed up and we really aren't getting any answers from the local officials. And so you're having coffee with your readers, you're building trust, you're creating a profitable enterprise, mixing the cafe with journalism. And then CBS News comes along and puts it on CBS Sunday morning. So if you're in Ohio or in Hawaii, you could say, oh, wow, our newsroom could have a cafe too. So there is still a role for the headline. There was a wonderful example in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a farmer, 85-year-old guy, I think, who has a couple hundred acres there. His land was being sought by an AI, data center. They were going to pay something like $15 million to buy his land. And he chose to sell it to a local conservancy to be perpetually in farming for $2 million, which is great. What a hero, and that I saw that got picked up here and there by major media. Wonderful interview. I've been meaning to put it on my Sustain What blog because it's such an encouraging example. But it was, I think, the local Lancaster, I think it was the website of the Conservancy itself did an interview with him that I think sparked the local coverage and then national coverage. So media are like an ecosystem, and if you can still get your headline, but as I said in that case, I think it was a local conservancy that they put the video on their website initially, and then it spread and spread.
On Solutionary Voices, we're exploring, as I mentioned before, approaches that identify root and systemic causes of problems and elevate solutions that do the most good and the least harm. So if you were designing a solutionary journalism beat from scratch, focused on climate and the environment, what would it look like? And maybe it looks just like Sustain What, in which case, tell the audience a little bit more about Sustain What.
The media landscape is like any other landscape. You need the big entities. Radio is another one, obviously, NPR, and which is surviving for the moment. The challenges it's facing is a great national treasure. But what you can do locally is find ways to get at these granular questions, treat them as questions. Don't wait for the clean and neat story to emerge. Be out there as a young journalist trying to convey what's happening in the world around you and what's real. There are examples. I see hopeful examples in many places, and it's not always a conventional journalist. When Hurricane Helene devastated Western North Carolina, there was a local guy who's a YouTuber. He's like a paragliding YouTuber. There are YouTubers who do every little thing. And he kind of just has his paraglider, goes out there and makes videos. But after the hurricane struck, and there was all this horrific lying about what was happening, masses of bodies in some local town. And he went there himself. He hiked in to this one town which was sort of a hot spot for misinformation that was being amplified by right wingers, and he started videotaping and YouTubing what he was seeing, and he talking to local people. They were cleaning up devastated streets and stuff, but there were not bodies lying around, and that capacity is there in almost any of us to. Well, you're seeing it now with Minnesota. people with phones are now reality checking and exposing malfeasance. I think that landscape obviously can create problems. We know how much untruth can spread, and how a maliciously edited video, or now with AI, how it's just becoming hard to know what's real. But if you have intentionality, if you want to become in your community a source of reliable information in turbulent times, you can do that. It's not always going to be someone like me. So one thing, I mean, along with Sustain What, I've been running little workshops in what I call Thriving Online. I started this a long time ago when I was teaching at Pace University, but it never really built into a bigger thing there. And it sounds almost laughable, the idea of thriving online. But there are ways to do this, and I'm sure anyone listening will know someone on Facebook who is posting reality-based content and trying to help us navigate all the murk. I know many people who it's not their line of work, but they're helping do that. And becoming one of those people is a model for revealing the real full dimensional landscapes around us, and getting us out of this sort of binary enemy hero mode that the internet is trying to squeeze us into. And journalists who want to succeed in this I think that model is a key part of what journalists can do themselves. And some of that is just demonstrating good practice, and some of it might be actively saying, hey, you can do this too. And with Sustain What, I try to use conversation to navigate tough issues. And every show I start, I say, this is a journey. Don't expect in an hour you're going to see, oh, yay, we're done. Issues like meat cultivation and all the different climate questions and disaster risk reduction are never about a single outcome. So just figuring out how to foster conversation is another part of this. Cut across barriers, and again, and that doesn't have to be through a screen. It could be in your local village hall or on your city block. Models that excite me. There's a guy in San Francisco whose name I'm forgetting, but who started a practice of having sort of block by block gatherings where people look at their vulnerabilities to disaster risk, their earthquake, tsunami, etc. And if we had that capacity or interest in building community resilience to the various threats we all face, that's another thing that anyone can do. And you don't have to be a journalist necessarily, but building those conversations is something we can all work to do.
One of the things that I'm thinking in terms of what you just said is, how would a budding solutionary journalist make a living at this? But if you were to imagine journalism at its best in the next decade, what role do you hope it plays in shaping our collective response to planetary crises?
Well, I'll still stick with the notion that journalism is not singular. Journalism is a general concept, but journalists come in all varieties, and all those different varieties can play a good role in an overall shift that survives the information superstorm that we're living in, and actually not just survives, but can thrive by creating a zone that's not turbulent. And that will always have these different components. There are journalists who are activists. There are journalists on the climate beat who are just focused on Exxon and bad industrial behavior and corporate behavior. And that's fine. Amy Westerfeld does her Drilled podcasts, and she's great. And she's revealing the deep history of lying and lobbying by oil companies and the like, and how they've distorted federal efforts to solve the climate, to cut emissions of greenhouse gases. And I do my sustain what thing, which is much more of an open approach to vulnerability reduction and emissions reduction. And they're all part of the mix. So one thing is not to think of journalism as a unitary entity and how it's not an it's a they. And it comes in all flavors, and they all have a place a role to play, and they all can make things worse too. So obviously, how you foster best practices across those different arenas. One thing that actually has been valuable, I think, is some activists have been pressing media, the corporate media, to take less advertising from fossil fuel companies, for example. And I think that makes sense. The New York Times, I wrote on my blog a few years ago about some aspects of what the New York Times was doing with making money, not just posting ads for oil and gas companies, but making the ads themselves. The New York Times has a subsidiary that makes what's called branded content, and they were doing it for Shell. And I kind of said, hey, come on. They're making good money now. The New York Times is making money. It's a profitable operation, but you don't need to do that. So all of that adds up to some significant possibilities. The challenges for journalism writ large are enormous, but there's lots of ways to make progress.
I would imagine that not many people know that you're not just a solutionary journalist. You're also a solutionary singer and songwriter. And I wonder if you might sing us a song that you wrote. Maybe your dogs will join in if we're lucky.
Oh, sure. So, I consider myself multimedia. Music is part of what I consider multimedia communication. This song is about the future. I was in a songwriting brainstorm, and they said, write a song involving a time machine. And I had no idea what to do. And then this came out. Don't know how I got here 2044. Somehow the world avoided nuclear war. Somehow the climate didn't go to hell. Somehow the Constitution never fell. Presidential candidates are on the stump. Sasha Obama and Barron Trump. That's not the weirdest thing I had to relate. They're both kind of sane and talking pretty straight. That change didn't happen on its own. Sun let out a flare and all our circuits were blown. AI fried, satellites died, people had to live without a telephone. Don't know how I got here 2044. Somehow the world avoided nuclear war. Somehow the climate didn't go to hell. Somehow the Constitution never fell. Of course, that is a dream. The sun won't set us straight. It'll take a lot of work to really make this country great again. So join yourself a club or your PTA. Even run for office if you feel that way. Find yourself a goal that suits your skills and heart. That's how we'll take back the power from the oligarchs. Said, find yourself a goal that suits your skills and heart. That's how we'll take back the power from the oligarchs. Don't know how I got here 2044. Somehow the world avoided nuclear war. Somehow the climate didn't go to hell. Somehow the Constitution never failed. Never failed.
I love that song so much. I love how, embedded in one of the lines is, find your goal that serves you and the world and your heart. And that is the solutionary message. So thank you so much for that. So I have one final question for you, Andy, which is, what would you like your epitaph to be?
Well, the one that I used to joke about is Revkin. He ain't no caddy. When I was a kid, I was trying to be a caddy at the local golf course, and I was too small, and the caddy master once kind of fired me when I was the last caddy left in the shack. And my friend said, "Oh yeah, Revkin's still here, and he needed a caddy." He said, "Oh, Revkin, he ain't no caddy." but realistically, oh gosh, he tried to convey a path.
It's a hard question, and you have conveyed a path, and your writing, your videos, your songwriting, all of it has been offering people a path toward making this world more sustainable and just, and doing so in a way that recognizes complexity and nuance. And I'm really grateful to you for all of your work in that regard.
Well, I appreciate the gratitude.
Thank you, Andy, so much for being with us today.
Sure, thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Solutionary Voices and that you'll follow Andy Revkin's Sustain What videocast and Substack. And if you like what you heard today, please do share it with others and subscribe and offer us a review. And if you would like to be a solutionary yourself, I invite you to read my book, The Solutionary Way. Thanks so much for tuning in.